ancient lands, your storied pomp, cries she with silent lips. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shores. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door.
Jalal T. Salihi was born on December 6, 1925, in Suleimania, Iraq. He lived in a house occupied by his grandfather Fathullah and Fathullah's two brothers. Each had their own family.
Yeah, I had 5 brothers and 6 sisters, but my father has 2 wives.
As was the Kurdish custom of the time, each brother's family occupied one section of the family's home, but all families shared the responsibility of cooking and taking care of the children. They used oil lamps for lighting, and their home was supplied with water by a natural spring that fed a pond near their home. In typical Kurdish fashion, his father Tawfiq Fathullah and his mother Atiya, along with himself and his sister Akhtar, remained in their home after their grandfather's death. When he was 3 years old, his family moved to Arbil, where he would live for 6 years until he finished the 1st grade. He remembers those days as the most interesting of his early development because of his growing curious nature. He would observe the behavior of insects, play with the gramophone, and bury coins in hope that they would grow.
Well, I was always moving, never sit. And I was making, like to investigate. For example, that's crazy, I used to grow money, expecting that they will give me some fruit, but I wasn't successful.
All right, I gotta stop. I'm telling you the story of one of the greatest minds in the 20th century, and I'm making it sound mundane. It wasn't mundane, not even close. This young boy grew up in a territory that was constantly in a state of war and unrest.
At the beginning, that the Kurds were living in their area, and problems started, The bombing came later, when the British, came in, and Kurdistan was one of the first places that the British, bombed.
You and I wouldn't have lived in the house that this man grew up in. But in typical Jalal fashion, he tells it in humility. This man doesn't need to be humble. One of his earliest memories was him realizing that he needed to run for cover when the local cats left the village. For some reason, the cats had an instinct for a pending bombing attack. No one should grow up like that. He won't tell you, but this man is a genius. And I want everyone who hears this to understand where this man came from. After finishing 1st grade, his father was transferred to Kirkuk.
After that, my father was working for the government, and we were transferred to Arbil. And it's interesting, one of the places we lived was the top of the hill in Arbil, which is called Qal'a. But we used to live in that house at the edge of the Qal'a, you could see, all the plains. So that was very interesting.
Most of us won't understand this, but being Kurdish in Iraq meant being ostracized. They don't have a government that represents them. And Kurdish communities have a small fraction of schools that the rest of Iraq enjoys. For example, in 1945, the Iraqi government awarded 60 scholarships to high school graduates to study engineering in England.
But fortunately, the first and second of Iraq, they had the best, one of the best schools in their area, One of them withdrew from electrical engineering, and we had a Kurdish influential guy in the government, and he did help. He helped me, to change my field to electrical engineering. That was one of the best things that happened.
My friend Jalal was the only one of Kurdish descent to be awarded this scholarship. He received a degree from the University of Leeds, England, in 1948 after only 3 years. He finished far earlier than the other 59 Iraqi scholarship winners. When he went to the office of the Iraqi cultural attaché in London to announce his accomplishments, his fate was sealed for his first contribution to the entire world. Mr. Hikmat Abdul Majid reminded him that he had 2 years left of his scholarship to his credit, and made arrangements for Jalal to do practical training at the British Radio and Telephone Training School.
Go to training to Central Training School by the post office. So I went there and got exposed to radio and telephone. When you ask for a number, you dial, and it goes up, and then the other side, and this was a very incentive for me finally to study telephony, and try to improve it, I have one of the best contribution to the field of telephone, but that was after several years,
After the experiences with the enormous switchboards and the practical training was completed, Jalal would obtain the MS and the PhD degree of electrical engineering from the University of California, Berkeley in 1954 and 57. This would lead to an 18-month research project at the Lynn-Kurt Electric Company in Menlo Park, California. It was during this time that Jalal developed a prototype static electronic selector. This would eliminate the mechanical selector in switchboards nationwide. Additionally, he designed and built a voltage regulator because of its small size is still used in all electronic devices today. And that's my friend, by the way. After 18 months with Lynn-Kurt, Jalal would return to Iraq with his wife Mary and his newborn daughter Shireen in 1959.
When I was in Berkeley and after we got married, my daughter Shireen was born in the United States. And after we went back, Danny was born. Danny was born in Iraq, my son. So of course I have one girl and one boy, Shireen and Danny. Shireen means sweet, and Danny means kind of intelligent, in Kurdish.
And this still boggles my mind. This man single-handedly revolutionized telephone switchboards and made every single electronic device that we use daily possible, and we can't persuade him to stay? I'm not the only person that thought so. The president of Lynn-Kurt Electric Company asked him to stay, but Jalal felt a sense of duty to his native country and insisted on returning. He became the head of the electrical engineering department of the University of Baghdad. It was during this time that Saddam Hussein and his party took control of the country. Things went from bad to worse, and threats were made on Jalal's family's lives.
A lot of people like me, even Arabs, they would support me, but then a few people tried to make a problem, So finally it became dangerous for me to stay. I sent Mary home to Santa Barbara. Let us say she went back home, and I stayed till the opportunity came for me to leave Iraq by secret.
Mary would escape prior to Jalal with their 2 children and relocate to Santa Barbara with her family. She would wait patiently for Jalal's escape, and as fate would have it, Jalal would have friends already at the defense laboratories. Dr. Saunders, who was Jalal's graduate advisor at the University of Berkeley, was a paid consultant to the General Motors defense laboratories. Additionally, an old colleague from the Lynn-Kurt Electrical Company by the name of Dr. Mueller was also employed there.
They wouldn't give me even permit to go. So I have to find some way, to escape, And I had a friend who helped me in that. But once I was out, then I didn't go back. And there I had a few friends. Some of them were from Lynn-Kurt, that I was working before, very nice. 3 or 4 good friends, One of them was transferred to Santa Barbara. So he found me a job at General Motors, joined General Motors Defense Laboratory, without interview.
Small world, huh? In 1963, Jalal was hired by the General Motors Defense Laboratories, where he directed research in brushless electric propulsion schemes and overall control systems for electric cars and off-highway vehicles. And this is where the story gets interesting. The paper trail for Electrovair 1 had Jalal as the main scientist in charge for research and development. And the subsequent building for Electrovair 2 and the Electrovan didn't. How could he be the main scientist of the Electrovair 1 and not even be mentioned in the building of Electrovair 2? The answer was military applications for what he had created. I can say without any hesitation that the team of Jalal and his friend George Spix are solely responsible for the creation of the very first fully functional, high-performance electric car, comparable to its gasoline counterpart.
I got transferred from Santa Barbara Defense Research Laboratory at General Motors. And where there I was in charge of building, electric cars. So one of my development was Electrovair 1. The first, practical electric car in the world, The engine of that car, was unique, in General Motors, was used for lunar vehicle later.
Totally immersing himself in the creation of Electrovair 1, the entire process took about 20 months to achieve. Testing began in the late summer of 1965, and Jalal was successful in this endeavor. So successful, in fact, that it became a problem for executives above him that had been looped into the sensitive overlapping applications of Jalal's work.
But I think maybe it had to do with the fact that I didn't have citizenship. Because when I came here, and when I'm working at that time in General, I didn't have the U.S. citizenship. I mean, they don't want the foreigner to get involved in defense,
With his lack of U.S. citizenship, this young idealist would be erased from the history books. Just for the record, he achieved U.S. citizenship in 1970, and he will always be remembered as the man that made the very first high-performance electric car a reality.
Well, of course, I'm proud that I built the first electric car. That's number one. And I was very happy, and still I'm happy about that. But then, of course, they playing tricks, to remove my name, that is not pleasant, at least.
After Jalal's accomplishment of Electrovair 1 was complete, Paul Agrawal ordered the second build to begin, Electrovair 2. This was the summer of 1965, and the second build of this program was virtually identical to Electrovair 1, besides one exception. The separate functions of a modulator and an inverter were combined to create an individual function modulating inverter.
All what I know, they changed the little part, which they shouldn't. They made it more complicated to build Electrovair 2. So Electrovair 1 and 2 were essentially the same. But one part of it, they divided to two, that's all. Well, that part, Electrovair, was changing, first of all, a DC voltage to AC. I made it in one stage. It was simpler, and they just make a little change in that.
This was the brainchild of Richard W. Johnston. He would receive credit for this design individually after the public release of Electrovair 2. The two cars would be reviewed internally by General Motors in January 1966 in addition to the Electrovan. The three builds would be showcased together at the General Motors Technical Center and released to the press on October 28, 1966. Because of the reasons mentioned prior, Paul Agrawal ordered the destruction of Electrovair 1 afterwards. Jalal's strides and efforts would be forgotten, and the car that Paul would have more involvement in would be remembered by history, even though the research, design, and builds credit should have been received by history books from a different scientist. Richard W. Johnston would take the place of Jalal and would be remembered for his secondary input to the Electrovair 2 project. His technology would ultimately make the transition from the shopper car program to the Sterling electric hybrid a reality, with a classified stop in between for the lunar vehicles. Late in 1965, prior to the relocation of the division to Warren, Michigan, an internal personal review was done on Paul Agrawal's personal leadership. This led to internal disputes and a work environment that was not cohesive for the Santa Barbara group. Jalal would remain at General Motors feeling like an outsider until he joined the Advanced Automotive Power Systems Development Division of the EPA in 1971.
So when I went there, I became the chief, that was my title, of hybrid and electric system branch. So I was responsible for the development of the hybrid cars in the United States.
In Ann Arbor, Michigan, he would become the chief of the Hybrid Electric Systems branch, heading the development programs for batteries and propulsion systems for electric and hybrid cars. Ultimately, he would become the assistant to the director of that division. After these pursuits, he would revolutionize elevators while being employed at Otis Elevator and the U.S. Elevator Company. These days, he's fascinated with his hummingbirds and continues to love his splendid wife, Mary. I never met Shireen and Dana, but you two have a wonderful story to tell. Your father was admired and well loved at the General Motors Defense Laboratories.